Hello, my name is Brian Dennis. Thank you for viewing my presentation called Reading Between the Lines, Fiction's Impact on Mental Health. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction, go into my method section, followed by results, what we found, and finally end up with my discussion and a take-home message. So I chose this study because reading is a major personal hobby of mine. It always has been for as long as I can remember. But apart from that, the variables we looked at are incredibly important for society as a whole, not just counselors. Empathy is pretty essential for forging and maintaining meaningful and healthy relationships with others. The more that we engage with empathy or are empathetic, the better we kind of relate to one another. And by being empathetic, we can help to engage in better emotional regulation and improve resilience. Empathy has also been suggested to facilitate or promote prosocial behavior or helping behavior or altruism, if you prefer that. And prosocial behavior can help to deter antisocial behavior, fend off depression, and improve our overall health. Finally, enhanced psychological well-being can work to kind of improve and influence our physical capabilities, our capacities, by influencing a lower mortality or increasing our overall physical longevity. Finally, reading is incredibly accessible. Most people can read, but if people don't like reading or can't read, there's also the option of audiobooks now, which have been widely available now for quite some time. Um, Braille is also an alternative for people that can't physically read. They have a visual impairment. So from there, previous research has shown or suggested that fiction has an influence on those three variables that I mentioned. They have been linked partially, but there's no like total demonstration. They've been shown to have a sort of mutual influence on one another. Like I said, empathy and prosocial behavior have been suggested to have an influence on one another or a promotion on the other. Same with empathy and psychological well-being. Goes on sort of like that, but they have never been fully linked together as a totality. So the research question we devised was, what is the impact of reading fiction on empathy, prosocial behavior, and psychological well-being over a 7-day period? Because we wanted to control for a longer period of time instead of immediate exposure. So here are our four hypotheses. The first three are the same, they're worded the same, but we just replace the variables as I've underlined. So the first three are: participants who read fiction at least 10 minutes per day for 1 week will report an increased level of empathy, psychological well-being, and prosocial behavior compared to participants who read nonfiction. Then our fourth hypothesis was participants who report spending more time reading will demonstrate higher levels of empathy, prosocial behavior, and psychological well-being. So our study took place over two stages: pre and post questionnaire, which was accessed online through a Qualtrics link by Bangor University psychology undergraduate students. And once they were done with the study, they were given course credits towards their degree. So stage one gathered demographics questions, reading habits, reading preferences along the variables that we were measuring. Participants were then allocated randomly into either a fiction or nonfiction group at the end of stage one and got to choose their books based on that. And we had them choose their own book just to mitigate any kind of distressing content or exposure to any potentially distressing content. We also wanted them to enjoy the book that they were reading. So in between stage one and two, participants were asked to read for 7 days, a minimum of 10 minutes per day. After the 7 days had passed, they would have access to the stage two questionnaire. They could always read more than the 10 minutes per day, but that was just in case. We didn't want to stop anyone from reading more. Stage two gathered information about the book, title, author, genre, that kind of thing. How much time the participants spent reading, how much they enjoyed reading, alongside the same variables that we mentioned and measured in stage one. Empathy was measured using the Toronto Empathy Questionnaire. Prosocial behavior was measured using the prosocialness scale for adults, and psychological well-being was measured via the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Well-being Scale. Everything else in the study and the questionnaires, like reading behavior and preferences across both stages, that was created just by myself and the other researchers, just by us. So for stage 1, we had 36 participants, 11 male and 23 female, 14 participants in stage 2, 2 male and 12 female, and then 8 in the fiction group and 6 in the nonfiction group. So as you can see from our table as well, we had an average empathy score of 48.4 out of 64. Average prosocial scores were 61.1 out of a maximum of 80, and then average well-being scores were 44.2 out of a maximum of 70. These were all stage 1 correlations as well. As you can see, the sample size is 36 for each variable. I will touch on the time variable in the next slide as well. But if you also see this, there were some stage 1 correlations, found a significant relationship between empathy and prosocial scores, denoted by the 0.37, where the empathy and prosocial values intersect. So that is the correlational coefficient, that is not the significance value. I made a note at the bottom. It is a significant value. And this finding solidifies further or previous research as well. So as you can see here, this is a pie chart of all the time spent reading per week for stage 1 participants. The majority of them reported reading between 2 and 6 hours per week, and so 41%, with nearly a quarter of respondents only reading when necessary or not reading at all, and then about a fifth of participants reading about an hour a week, with only 15% reading more than 6 hours a week. So this is our stage 2 ANOVA results. We ran a 2-way repeated measures ANOVA. We found that scores largely remained unchanged. There were some minuscule increases, decreases, and in one case, scores actually stayed the same. As you can see from the table, the average empathy score for the fiction group in stage 1 was a 48.6, and that went down to 48. In the nonfiction group, it was 50.2, went down to 49.2. Well-being for the fiction group went from 46.7 to 47.7. For the nonfiction group, went from 49.5 and stayed the same at 49.5. For the fiction group in the prosocial measure was 60.2 and actually increased 2 points to 62.7. And then the nonfiction group for prosocial went from 58.8 to 59.5. So overall, not a lot of increase, some decreases, and in one case, everything stayed the same. So I wanted to just briefly touch on this before we move on. As you can see from this graph, this is demonstrating how many days were spent reading in the 7 days between the 2 questionnaires. So as I said before, participants were to read for 10 minutes a day for 7 days. As you can see from this, 37% read on all 7 days as intended. Out of the 14 participants, another 37% read for 5 days, and then 26% read for 2 days and 4 days respectively. So just to reiterate just how little things changed, I wanted to put these into graphs. So here's the average empathy scores across both groups and both stages. As you can see, the blue line is for the fiction group, orange line is nonfiction, and it shows the steady decrease in the very slight decrease for both stages in both groups, which is pretty interesting. The graph is a little dramatic. It's like I said, a point or two, if that. It's about a point, I think, with the empathy group. And it's the same with the well-being group. There was only a slight increase for fiction, and there was no change for the nonfiction group. Finally, with the prosocial group, there was a 2-point increase with the fiction group, and only, I'd say, about less than a point for the nonfiction group. But apart from that, outside of our hypotheses, we actually found a strong correlation between the stage 1 overall reading preference indications and reported well-being for those participants. So participants who did indicate a preference of either reading fiction or nonfiction, it didn't matter which one, they demonstrated or reported a significantly higher well-being score in stage 1 compared to participants who just indicated no preference. So as you can see from the table at the bottom, participants who reported or indicated a preference for fiction reported a average well-being score of 47.7. People who indicated a preference for nonfiction reported a well-being score on average of 46. In comparison, people who didn't indicate a preference reported an average well-being score of 36.6. So what does this all mean then? We can say that no hypotheses were supported. We cannot say that reading influences empathy, psychological well-being, and prosocial behavior over a 7-day period, at least significantly. Further, we can say that hypotheses 1 through 3 were not supported because we did not see any changes from our ANOVA, as I demonstrated earlier. And while there are lots of limitations in this study, I do attribute partially one of these to that outcome. So while the sole reason for our insignificance was not because of this is just one limitation, of course, that I'm going to touch on. So most stage 2 participants did not read for all 7 days as intended. I think 37% read for all 7 days, and then another 37% read for 5 days, which is close, but ideally it would have been all 14 of them read for all 7 days or more. That would have been nice, but that's okay. So this was partially mitigated by the participants being able to choose what they were reading. We did that to increase motivation and engagement with the study because we wanted them to enjoy the study. We wanted them to read as much as they could or wanted to. But despite this, it just shows that establishing a habit like this is very difficult. It cannot be forced. It has to come naturally. It has to come from your own desire to want to read. You have to want to read and not have some sort of external thing weighing you down or telling you to read. This also just reinforces how difficult it is to establish a habit. Like I said, it is difficult to establish a habit, especially when you are a university student and you have an already very hectic life like our participants did. Further, hypothesis 4 was not supported, as reading more per week did not correlate with higher empathy, prosocial behavior, or psychological well-being scores during our stage 1 questionnaire. And I partially attribute this to our lack of deeper measures. We used a singular questionnaire for each variable. They were each between 14 and 16 questions. Ideally, we would have used deeper measures, but that would have possibly and likely resulted in participant fatigue, especially considering the rewards the participants were getting. They're getting required course credits, so they had to participate in a study regardless. But if we were to use greater incentives, such as prizes or money, they would be more likely, to engage in a longer study. Further, we could use behavioral tasks to measure objective prosocial behavior. Like we could do that without the participants knowing, instead of using subjective questionnaires. Further, we could have measured cognitive empathy versus affective empathy to get a deeper understanding of the participants' reported empathy. Finally, we could have followed in the footsteps of previous studies by measuring the dimensions of psychological well-being. There's lots of dimensions. Just narrowing it down to 14 to 15 questions is not very helpful, but like I said, we were trying to minimize participant fatigue. By focusing on more specific dimensions, we could have gotten a better idea of the psychological well-being differences among the participants. For example, self-acceptance, autonomy, purpose, that kind of thing. So our additional findings, which were significant, as I mentioned earlier, suggest that having a preference of either genre, either fiction or nonfiction, can be indicative of more habitual reading, and this habitual reading could instigate or suggest a higher psychological well-being, but that would take longer to establish, longer than a week, as we found out in our stage 2 results, but it does and can manifest, as we found in our stage 1 results. So what are the implications of this? This shows that regular reading, including nonfiction, could be utilized in counseling to promote self-care among clients and counselors, which can help them detach from daily stressors and mitigate any psychological distress, primarily within clients that they may be going through. Further, reading groups in counseling and community bases could be implemented with the same purpose, which could help promote structure and community among potentially isolated peers or clients. And this regular social connection experienced within the groups and communities could help to increase or enhance well-being as well. On a larger level, policymakers could be informed of the benefits of this type of group, this regular reading, and allocate funding to this type of intervention for increased opportunities within schools or community services when considering educational or community level mental health enhancements. So, when considering future research, I would recommend using deeper measures to gain a more specific understanding of psychological well-being, something that includes all the varying dimensions of psychological well-being, as I touched on earlier, as well as another measure that separates between cognitive and affective empathy, just to gain a more concrete and complete understanding of someone's empathy. Further, I would recommend using behavioral tasks to measure prosocial behavior in a more objective form rather than just using a self-report questionnaire. Also, I would use the exploration of differences in responses to differing genres and the influence they have on participants' empathy, prosocial behavior, and psychological well-being. So, for example, I would recommend exposing the same participants to different subgenres within fiction, such as romance or horror or mystery novels, and just measuring the differences, if there are any, on those participants over time. That's with ideal resources and ideal no constraints or that sort of thing. Also, better incentivization, such as money or prizes rather than required course credits. Or using a single stage to minimize participant fatigue would be equally as beneficial. But that would be a separate study as well, and compare, like, when considering what I just said about the subgenres and everything. Finally, I would recommend conducting follow-up studies after the experiment to gauge any lasting effects, if there were any, from the habitual reading, if habitual reading did take place, of course. That's a big if. So my take-home message is that while we did not find anything significant in relation to our hypotheses, we did find something significant external to our hypotheses, and that was just that the signal of habitual reading, irrespective of what genre or what material is being read, as long as it is regular, with no regard to actual frequency or measurable time per week, that sort of thing, as long as you keep it up, that is what leads to this satisfaction or this increased psychological well-being, that sort of thing. So it doesn't matter if you're not reading 10 hours per week, as long as you are reading consistently at any sort of time, or time is sort of irrelevant, as long as you will just keep reading and keep engaging in reading with something that you enjoy reading, then you will find the benefits of psychological well-being beginning to manifest. So that's all I had. Thank you for watching and listening. Thank you.